Hello everyone, and welcome back to Transcendent Philosophy. This is Seth here, and today we're going to be reviewing episode 2 of John Vervaeke's After Socrates series. This is After Socrates Simplified. We're going to try to condense it, make it a little bit easier to process, get some visuals. Hopefully that'll be helpful. Today's episode is called Socrates the Monstrous. Okay? Now, just in case you're a little bit lost, there's prior episodes. You can check out the intro or episode 1 to get into a little bit more context. Otherwise, we're going to jump right into episode 2. Some of the topics we'll be covering: Socrates the Monstrous, Mataku, between finitude and transcendence, the Socratic Dialectic, the horizon of wonder, Dialectic into Dialogos, Dialogos into transcendence, Dialectic at different levels, Dialectic into Dialogos with a symphony of sages, and the Socratic Paradox. For the practices that we'll be going over, it will be finding your root and the humble wonder practice. Socrates the Monstrous. I've got an image here, a diagram of Socrates along multiple dimensions. And the interesting thing about this is that Socrates embodies multiple contradictory attributes. For example, we've got him as the sage, but also as the fool. We've got him as pious to the gods and irreverent. We've got him as a revered teacher and as a social outcast. He's both humble and confident. So the idea of Socrates the Monstrous is that he's hard to put into a box. He embodies such contradicting attributes that he transcends categorization. And that is what it seems to be what Vervaeke is referring to as monstrous. The monster is violating our normal categories, right? And you might wonder why Socrates would live in such a way, in such a contradictory way. And perhaps there's some hidden wisdom behind embracing contradictions. Perhaps there's a virtue in balancing yourself between opposites, right? That kind of leans into Aristotelian virtue ethics. And so perhaps this is a hint at the path to wisdom. Mataku. Mataku is this abstract space that's in between the finite and the infinite. It's in between the mortal realm and the divine realm. It's between ignorance and knowledge, right? The ancient Greeks, they kind of abstracted out this mystical realm where, geometry was essential to philosophy, the perfect circle and the perfect triangle. And in this mortal realm of life, there's no such thing as a perfect circle. We attempt it, but mathematically we can never achieve it. That's why pi is infinite in number. So the infinity of pi exists in this imaginary, abstract place of infinites. And we are too finite to ever appreciate its infinites. But Socrates, he wants to understand the truth. He wants to understand knowledge. He wants to transcend the limits of finitude, transcend the limits of human reality. He wants to transcend human ignorance. He wants to find a way to bridge the gap between us and the gods. And so in his quest, he's pursuing this pathway that exists within Mataku. This bridge is essential because that's the connection. And Mataku, understanding Mataku, gives us the bridge to the knowledge we're seeking. The Socratic Dialectic. Thesis plus antithesis leads to learned ignorance. So you can see here we're trying to symbolize the dialectic through the yin-yang symbol. So the dialectic is when two contradictory things interact, and this interaction creates something new. And so what's happening here is the thesis is what we bring as like positive knowledge. The antithesis is when we bring negative contradiction, and somehow we have to reconcile what we think is true with a contradiction, and somehow we reconcile it and we get to someplace new, right? So Socrates, in his dialogues, he would frequently challenge people's knowledge claims. And so someone would say, oh, I have knowledge about justice. And then Socrates, he would start to poke some holes into their definition of justice. And so that was his refutation. It was his antithesis. And so the person who thinks that they know what justice is, they have to deal with Socrates' counterexamples, and that creates a little bit of confusion. But then what Vervaeke is saying is that the goal of this process is to lead us to learned ignorance. So at the beginning, the interlocutor, they think that they know what justice is. They have a naive false knowledge because their knowledge is not complete. And so Socrates, he pokes some holes and say, hey, you got to fill in your definition of justice. You need to fill in some holes because it's not complete. And so he's bringing them towards this place, which Vervaeke calls the horizon of wonder. And he's showing them this contradiction. He's showing them the places where they're ignorant, and they have to face this irony. They have to face this contradiction. And so if they can embrace it, they're learning what they're ignorant of. And so that's how we get to learned ignorance. By identifying all of the holes of ignorance, we become learned about our ignorance. The horizon of wonder. Most people are frustrated when you poke holes in their explanations, when you refute them, and when you show them what they're ignorant of. Frustrating, negative emotion. But Vervaeke is trying to help us reframe it into a horizon of wonder, so we can appreciate, we can be grateful. Thank you for showing me what I'm ignorant of. Look at this vast landscape of all of these new things I can learn. Right? By shifting our mentality, we can grow. Dialectic into Dialogos. So we have learned ignorance, which leads to horizon of wonder, which leads to Dialogos. And for learned ignorance, we're showing that as the yin-yang symbol, where we are simultaneously aware of our truth claim and the contradictions. And we're aware of it, and so we've learned all of these things we're ignorant of, but we haven't figured out how to synthesize it yet. They're just coexisting. We're just accepting this coexistence of contradiction, and we're embracing, and that's when it leads to the horizon of wonder, where we zoom in on this ignorance and we try to figure it out because we appreciate it and we're curious. And so there's this border, right? But in the yin-yang symbol, there's this border between the truth claim and the ignorance. And so we're trying to bridge this gap here. So we're zooming into the border. We're trying to figure out, how do these things connect together, right? And so this Vervaeke said, wisdom begins in wonder. So when we're curious and appreciative of this connection, we're going to investigate it and try to figure it out, which will give us a bigger understanding. And so that leads us to Dialogos. Dialogos is this abstract idea that I'm trying to simplify here. I'm simplified it into the phrase, follow the logos, and further simplification, follow the flow of logic. Okay, so Dialogos is similar to dialogue, and when you're talking with someone, I say something, you say something, I respond, you respond. We're following a logical flow in the conversation, where it's I say one thing with my bias, and then you say something with your bias, and then I say something with my bias, and you say something with your bias, and we're rotating through, but we're kind of converging because we appreciate each other's perspective. We're converging on something important. And so when we get down to this horizon of wonder, we're seeing the gap, we're seeing the midpoint between our two arguments, and we're trying to follow that midpoint to see where it leads. Dialogos into transcendence. Dialogos leads to philia, which leads to transframing. So as we're following this flow of the logic, as we converse, as we interact, as we respect the contradictions and investigate them, we're flowing towards this mutual midwifing. So because we're respecting each other, we're creating philia. Philia is friendship love. I appreciate your perspective. I'm taking it seriously. And when you do that with each other, you're evolving each other. And so this mutual midwifing is educing something new, bringing forth some new creation within each other. So through this illustration here, the yang, the person with the yang bias, is creating some space within themselves, some gray area. Whereas before, I was just, everything is black and white. Now I'm appreciating your perspective. I'm like, well, maybe some of it is gray. Maybe there is some nuance here. Maybe it's not all like I thought. And the other person, they have, instead of the yang bias, they have the yin bias, but they're also appreciating your perspective, and they're bringing some gray in too. So you're bringing in a piece of each other into yourself, and that's giving birth to nuance and complexity and maybe transformation. And so that mutual midwifing is creating something new within each other because of interacting with love, friendship love. And finally, this philia brings us to transframing. So because we allowed something new to grow within us, eventually that new perspective can grow, and now we can look at the problem from a new angle of analysis. We can get a higher vantage point. And that's, we're transcending the prior framing. So the prior way we looked at it, we're getting a new way to look at it, and that gives us a better, gives us more insight into the problem. And so that's how Dialogos is bringing us towards this type of transcendence. Dialectic at different levels. Here we have images representing the internal dialectic, the Socratic dialectic, the social dialectic, and the natural dialectic. And so what we can see here is that there's contradictions at multiple levels of analysis. So even within your own mind, you can self-contradict. Sometimes within your mind, you'll have two different contradictory ideas, and that creates cognitive dissonance. It's uncomfortable. We want harmony. We want consistency. And so we have to figure out how to reconcile contradictions within our mind so we can have a more holistic perspective. And so our minds are creating internal dialectics to lead us towards new perspectives. But when we interact with other people, we create the Socratic dialectic. Two different people, two different ideas, and they interact. The social dialectic, two different political groups, two different ideologies, they debate, and they have to figure out how to reconcile contradictions. And then the natural dialectic is humanity versus nature. Sometimes our opinions and the natural world contradict, and we have to figure out how to have harmony with nature by resolving those contradictions. Dialectic into Dialogos with a symphony of sages. So here I've diagrammed out this kind of cycle of, and not a cycle of life, it's a cycle of wisdom. And you can see on the left, it starts with the internal dialectic. It leads to the Socratic dialectic, which leads to the social dialectic, which leads to the natural dialectic. And then it filters in through this ecology or ecosystem of sages. You've got some Indian sages, and you've got Jesus Christ, you've got Socrates, Confucius, Buddha. And those sages then filter back into the individual. So the world produces some sages, and then the sages, they inspire the individual, and then it cycles through this cycle of wisdom. And so Vervaeke is suggesting that if we can incorporate a multiplicity of sages, that might better inform us into a better interaction with the subsequent dialectics. And as we improve our dialectics, the entire world is going to be cycling to a better place together. Socratic Paradox. Socrates claimed three things: that the best human life is the life of virtue, and that virtue requires knowledge, and that he himself does not possess knowledge. Well, what are we to make of this? If Socrates has no knowledge, then he has no virtue, and then he doesn't have the best human life, and maybe we shouldn't look to him as an example and we should disregard him? Is this how we should interpret the paradox? Or is there something more to be gathered from this paradox? Socrates, when he claimed that he did not possess knowledge, he actually said something to the effect of, "I know that I know nothing." Now that's different from not possessing knowledge. He does possess knowledge. He knows that he knows nothing. And so this phrase can be interpreted into learned ignorance. And learned ignorance can be interpreted into the virtue of epistemic humility. And so by knowing that he knew nothing, he simultaneously obtained the virtue of epistemic humility. He did know something, therefore he did have a virtue, therefore he was living something like the best life. And so maybe he is worth emulating. Maybe there is something to this path that he embodied for us. Maybe it's not about having complete knowledge and complete virtue. Maybe it's being humble enough to get on the path to greater knowledge and greater virtue. And in fact, Socrates, he seemed willing to die for these principles. In fact, he did die for these principles. Socrates said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And so this process of philosophic examination was the way he created learned ignorance. It was how he created and embodied the virtue of epistemic humility. By constantly examining knowledge and knowledge claims, he was able to find this humility of ignorance, right? And so this process of philosophic examination, this process of embodying epistemic virtues, it was so important to him that when he was told to stop it or die, he chose death, because the unexamined life is not worth living. And so, if you can find something that you are willing to die for, is that not purpose and meaning? Is that not something that has transcendent value? Maybe we should take Socrates seriously if he was willing to die for this. And now we've come to the practices. I think I'm going to place a little bit less emphasis on the practices because I think it's probably better to learn those from Vervaeke himself. So definitely go rewatch the original video if you haven't watched it to make sure you get it from him. But feel free to screenshot what I have on the screen, which is kind of a list of the steps to the first practice, which is finding your root. And simply, finding your root is it's the practice of centering and then meditating. And the other practice is the humble wonder practice. And humble wonder, it involves centering and rooting, meditating, and mentally saying to oneself a couple phrases that are listed here, and these phrases are meant to invoke the feeling of humble wonder. Again, feel free to screenshot to keep track of those.